Brooksville, Florida, was a quiet town where life rarely surprised anyone. Most days passed in the same calm rhythm. The grocery store opened at 7. The bakery filled the air with the smell of fresh bread by 8. By evening, the streets were nearly empty except for the occasional car returning home after work. Nothing extraordinary ever seemed to happen there. Dorothy Mae Henderson had lived in Brooksville for nearly 50 years. She was 74 now, her silver hair always neatly tied behind her head, her movements slow but careful. Her house stood on the edge of town, a small white building surrounded by a modest garden. Behind the house was a backyard that meant everything to her. There was a wooden bench, a few rose bushes, and in the center of a small flower bed stood a statue of the Virgin Mary. The statue was not large or expensive. It had been purchased decades earlier from a small religious shop after Dorothy lost her husband, Samuel, to a sudden heart attack. At the time, grief had felt like an endless storm, and the statue had been something simple to hold on to, a quiet symbol of faith during the darkest days of her life. For years, it had simply stood there. Rain fell on it. Sun faded its colors. Sometimes neighborhood children played near it while Dorothy watered the flowers. It was just a statue. Or at least, that was what everyone believed. Everything began to change in the summer of 2023. Dorothy's daughter had been involved in a tragic car accident in another state. She survived, but the situation forced her to stay in the hospital for months. Her 6-year-old daughter, Emma, suddenly had nowhere to go. So Emma came to live with Dorothy. The little girl arrived carrying a small pink backpack and a stuffed rabbit that she refused to let go of. At first, she barely spoke. She spent most of her time quietly sitting in the backyard, watching the birds, or drawing in the dirt with a stick. Dorothy tried her best to comfort her. They baked cookies together. They watched old cartoons in the evening. Sometimes they sat together on the bench near the statue of the Virgin Mary. One evening, just before sunset, Emma was sitting alone in the garden while Dorothy prepared dinner inside the house. The sky was glowing orange, and the air carried the soft sound of cicadas. Emma looked toward the statue. For a long moment, she simply stared. Then she whispered softly, as if speaking to someone standing there, "Are you crying?" When Dorothy stepped outside a few minutes later, Emma was still sitting in the same place. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" Dorothy asked. Emma pointed toward the statue. "Grandma, the lady is sad." Dorothy smiled gently. "That's just a statue, Emma." But the little girl shook her head slowly. There was water on her face. Dorothy walked closer. The statue stood exactly as it always had. Its stone surface looked dry in the fading sunlight. She brushed it lightly with her hand and found nothing unusual. "It's probably just rain from earlier," she said calmly. Emma didn't argue, but she continued looking at the statue for a long time. That night, a storm rolled through Brooksville. Rain fell heavily for several hours. The next morning, Dorothy stepped outside early to check the garden. She carried a watering can and walked toward the flower bed. Then she stopped. Something about the statue looked different. At first, she thought it was only a reflection of the morning light. But as she moved closer, she noticed thin streaks running down the statue's face. 2 small lines. Exactly where tears would fall. Dorothy frowned and touched the stone carefully. The surface was wet, but the rest of the statue was completely dry. She stood there silently for several seconds. Behind her, Emma walked slowly into the yard. The little girl looked up at the statue again. "I told you," Emma said quietly. Dorothy didn't respond. She simply stared at the statue, feeling an unfamiliar chill run down her spine. That was the moment when the story truly began. Within a few weeks, people from all across Florida would begin arriving at Dorothy's quiet backyard. Some would come searching for hope. Others would come looking for proof. And a few would arrive determined to prove that everything was nothing more than an illusion. But no one who visited that small backyard would ever forget what they saw there. Because the statue of the Virgin Mary had just begun to weep. The next few days passed quietly, but Dorothy could not stop thinking about what she had seen. Every morning she walked into the backyard and looked at the statue. Most of the time, nothing seemed unusual. But twice more that week, she noticed the same strange thing. Thin lines of moisture running down the Virgin Mary's cheeks. Each time the stone around the face felt cool and damp. Each time the rest of the statue remained completely dry. Dorothy tried to convince herself there was a logical explanation. Maybe water collected somewhere during the night. Maybe the stone absorbed humidity. Maybe she was simply imagining things. Still, she felt uneasy. Emma, however, seemed completely certain. "The lady is crying again," the girl said one morning as she stood beside the flower bed. Dorothy didn't answer immediately. She was beginning to realize something strange might truly be happening. At first she told no one. But small towns have a way of uncovering secrets. One afternoon, Dorothy's neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, stopped by to return a garden tool he had borrowed. He was a retired mechanic who lived 2 houses down the street and spent most of his days repairing old lawn mowers in his garage. As they spoke near the fence, Emma ran into the yard. "Grandma," she said excitedly, "the lady is crying again." Mr. Alvarez chuckled. "What lady?" Emma pointed toward the statue. Curious, the old man walked closer. Dorothy followed slowly behind him. The sunlight was bright that afternoon, and for a moment everything looked perfectly normal. But then Mr. Alvarez leaned forward. His smile faded. "Well, that's strange," he murmured. Dorothy felt her stomach tighten. He pointed toward the statue's face. 2 thin lines of moisture were slowly forming beneath the statue's eyes. The drops moved slowly down the pale stone surface, like tears sliding across skin. Mr. Alvarez touched the statue with his rough mechanic's hands. "It's wet," he said quietly, "but the rest of the stone is dry." For several seconds, none of them spoke. Finally he stepped back. "I don't know what that is," he said, shaking his head, "but I've never seen anything like it." That evening, Mr. Alvarez told his wife. His wife told her sister. And by the next morning, half the street had heard the story. At first the neighbors came only out of curiosity. 2 women from the house across the road stopped by while walking their dogs. A teenager rode over on his bicycle just to see if the story was true. Most expected to find nothing unusual, but several of them saw the same thing. Small drops of moisture forming on the statue's face. Word spread quickly through Brooksville. Within 3 days, people began arriving from other parts of town. Some came with cameras. Some came with flowers. Others simply stood quietly in the backyard, staring at the statue with disbelief. Dorothy never asked anyone for money. She never encouraged the attention. But she also never turned anyone away. "I don't know what it means," she told people honestly. "I'm just as confused as you are." Emma often sat quietly beside the flower bed while visitors came and went. Sometimes she would whisper to the statue as if speaking to a friend. A few visitors claimed they saw something else. They said the statue's expression looked different. Sadder. More human. Others believed it was simply water and imagination. Then, one Sunday afternoon, something happened that changed everything. A woman named Patricia Collins arrived from Tampa. She had driven nearly 2 hours after hearing the story from a friend. Patricia was 50 years old and had been battling cancer for almost 3 years. Doctors had told her that treatments were no longer working. She walked slowly into Dorothy's backyard and knelt in front of the statue. For nearly 10 minutes, she prayed silently. Everyone else stood quietly behind her. Then Patricia suddenly lifted her head. Her face was pale. Tears were running down her cheeks. "The tears," she whispered. "They're warm." Several people stepped closer. Dorothy felt her heart racing. The thin drops on the statue's face were still slowly moving downward. But now Patricia placed her fingers beneath them. She looked at the moisture on her hand with shock. "It's warm," she repeated. That moment would later appear in dozens of phone videos shared across the internet. Within 2 days, the story left Brooksville. News stations began calling Dorothy. Reporters started driving into town. Some people called it a miracle. Others called it a trick. But everyone wanted to see the statue. And soon, the quiet backyard that had once belonged only to Dorothy and Emma began filling with visitors from across the country. The small statue of the Virgin Mary had become the center of a mystery that no one could explain. And the world was only beginning to notice. Within 2 weeks, Brooksville was no longer the quiet town it had always been. Cars began arriving before sunrise. By mid-morning, a line of visitors often stretched down Dorothy Street. Some people traveled from nearby cities. Others drove hundreds of miles after hearing about the statue on television or seeing videos online. News vans parked along the sidewalks. Reporters stood in front of cameras describing what many had started calling the Weeping Virgin of Brooksville. Dorothy watched all of it with a mixture of confusion and concern. She had never wanted attention. She had never asked for crowds. Yet every day more people arrived, standing quietly in her backyard, hoping to witness the mysterious tears for themselves. Some visitors came out of curiosity, but many came because they were desperate. A young couple arrived carrying a photograph of their missing son. An elderly man with a cane asked Dorothy if he could pray for his failing heart. A mother brought her child who had been unable to walk since birth. Each person knelt in front of the statue. Each whispered their hopes into the warm Florida air. Sometimes nothing happened, but occasionally something strange seemed to occur. One afternoon, a man from Georgia collapsed to his knees after touching the statue's tears. He claimed the pain in his injured shoulder, something he had suffered from for nearly 10 years, had suddenly disappeared. Another visitor said the headaches that had troubled her for months stopped the moment she prayed in the garden. Word spread quickly through social media. For some people, the statue became a symbol of hope. For others, it became a reason for skepticism. Scientists and investigators soon arrived as well. A team from a university in Florida asked Dorothy for permission to examine the statue. They brought special cameras and instruments designed to detect hidden water sources or chemicals that might create the appearance of tears. Dorothy allowed them to study it. "I want to know the truth too," she said. The researchers carefully inspected every part of the statue. They checked for cracks where water might collect. They tested the stone for unusual minerals. They even removed a small microscopic sample to analyze in a laboratory. After several days of testing, they reached a frustrating conclusion. They found no clear explanation. The stone showed no internal reservoir of water. There were no hidden tubes, chemicals, or mechanisms. Nothing suggested the statue had been altered or manipulated. Still, the scientists refused to call it a miracle. "There may be a natural explanation we simply haven't discovered yet," one researcher told reporters. The investigation did not stop the visitors. If anything, it brought even more attention. Within a month, hundreds of people were arriving every week. Dorothy's quiet backyard began to look almost like a small pilgrimage site. Some visitors left flowers. Others placed candles near the flower bed. A local church eventually offered to help manage the crowds, placing a small wooden fence around the statue so people would not damage the garden. Through it all, Emma remained the calm center of the strange events. She spent hours sitting on the bench beside the statue. Sometimes she spoke softly to it, though no one could hear what she said. One evening, Dorothy asked her about it. "What do you talk about with the lady?" she asked gently. Emma thought for a moment. "She listens," the girl said. "Listens to what?" "To people." Dorothy frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Emma looked toward the statue, which stood glowing softly in the golden sunset. "She says people are very sad," Emma answered quietly. Dorothy felt a chill run through her. "What else does she say?" Emma shrugged. "She says the world forgets to be kind." The words lingered in Dorothy's mind long after the conversation ended. Meanwhile, the debate surrounding the statue continued to grow. Some religious leaders declared the tears a sign of divine compassion. Others warned people not to jump to conclusions. Skeptics claimed the entire event was nothing more than natural condensation combined with mass imagination. Yet one simple fact remained impossible to ignore. The statue continued to cry. Not constantly, not every day, but often enough that hundreds of witnesses had now seen the strange tears form and slowly roll down the Virgin Mary's stone face. And no one, not scientists, not reporters, not investigators, could explain why. But the most extraordinary moment was still yet to come. Because soon, something would happen in Dorothy's backyard that would leave even the most skeptical visitors completely silent. By early autumn, the story of the statue had spread far beyond Florida. People traveled from other states, and a few even arrived from other countries. Some came carrying Bibles. Some came with cameras. Others arrived quietly, saying nothing, simply standing in Dorothy's small backyard and staring at the statue that had become famous around the world. Yet despite the attention, Dorothy tried to keep life simple. She still watered the roses every morning. She still baked cookies with Emma in the afternoons. And every evening, as the sun lowered behind the trees, the two of them often sat together on the wooden bench near the statue. The crowds had begun to feel normal. But one evening in late September, something happened that no one expected. That day had been unusually busy. Nearly 100 visitors had come through the garden, leaving flowers and small notes in a basket near the statue. Some prayed. Others cried quietly. A few skeptics stood with folded arms, watching closely for signs of a trick. By sunset, the backyard was almost empty again. Only Dorothy, Emma, and a few remaining visitors remained. The air was warm and still. Golden light, filled the garden. Emma sat on the bench, swinging her feet slowly, while Dorothy spoke quietly with a woman who had traveled from Texas. Suddenly, Emma stood up. She walked toward the statue. "Grandma," she said softly. Dorothy turned. Emma was staring up at the statue's face again. Several of the remaining visitors noticed as well and stepped closer. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then someone gasped. 2 clear drops of moisture formed beneath the statue's eyes. The tears moved slowly down the stone cheeks, just as they had many times before. But this time something felt different. The air in the garden grew strangely quiet. Even the cicadas seemed to stop. Emma stepped closer to the statue. She looked up at it with an expression that was almost peaceful. Then she spoke very softly. "It's okay." Dorothy frowned slightly. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Emma didn't turn around. "She says people heard her." The visitors exchanged confused glances. Dorothy walked slowly toward the girl. "Heard what?" Emma finally looked back at her grandmother. "She says people remember now." No one spoke. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the evening wind. The last drops of moisture slid down the statue's face. And then something remarkable happened. The tears stopped. Completely. Days passed. Then weeks. Visitors continued arriving, hoping to see the statue cry again. But the stone face remained dry. Scientists returned once more to examine it. They still found nothing unusual. Reporters slowly moved on to other stories. The crowds grew smaller. Eventually, the backyard returned to the quiet garden it had once been. Yet something had clearly changed. Many people who had visited Dorothy's home said the experience had altered the way they saw the world. Some began helping their neighbors more. Some returned to faith they had abandoned years earlier. Others simply said the story reminded them that kindness mattered. Dorothy never claimed to know what had truly happened. When people asked her if she believed it had been a miracle, she always answered the same way. "I don't know," she would say gently. "But I do know one thing." She would look toward the statue standing peacefully among the roses. For a little while, people stopped and listened. Emma continued to sit near the statue often, especially in the evenings. Sometimes Dorothy would ask if the lady still spoke to her. Emma would simply smile. "She doesn't need to anymore," the girl once said. And in the quiet backyard of a small town that had briefly captured the attention of the world, the statue of the Virgin Mary stood silently once again. But the story of the summer when it cried would never completely disappear, because hundreds of people had seen the tears, and every one of them left that small garden believing something different about hope.